Hello, I'm Jennifer Byrne, and tonight's special is about as special as it gets, because it's about a unique category of book. Books so powerful, so persuasive, they actually changed the fabric of our world. They seeded ideas, they fired debate, they often provoked fierce resistance, but these were books which couldn't be ignored, and their influence is still with us. 4 guests from 4 very different backgrounds are here tonight to discuss the books they see as landmarks in their various fields. Starting with Danielle Clode, who began her studies in politics and psychology before receiving a Rhodes Scholarship and switching to zoology to complete her doctorate. Science and natural history are her big subjects now. The latest of her 6 books is A Future in Flames. Now, Mark Carnegie grew up wanting to be a marine biologist, but became a venture capitalist instead. He's spent the last 25 years as an investor and corporate advisor in New York, London and Sydney, and really annoyed some of his fellow bizoids last year by arguing the rich should pay more tax. Geoff Dyer is a critically acclaimed journalist, essayist and author who's been described as possibly the best living writer in Britain. No pressure then. He's an Oxford grad but claims his quality of study was much higher while living on the dole in Brixton in the early 80s. Finally, the formidable Christine Wallace, one of this country's leading political journalists, editor of Breakfast Politics, and notable biographer of, among others, John Hewson and Germaine Greer, though not Julia Gillard, for reasons we don't need to pursue here today. We are more than thrilled to have them all with us. Won't you please make them welcome? Let's start with you, Danielle, because you've chosen Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, which basically was the launch pad for the modern environmental movement. What was it about that book that took off and has registered so strongly with you?
Rachel Carson's book really documents the impact of pesticides particularly on the American countryside, but also around the world. So she as somebody involved in fisheries and agriculture, she could see the impact that these pesticides were having and the terrible destruction that they were causing. And her book was highly influential in having things like DDT regulated and removed from common use.
I assume you all are familiar with the book, or at least the influence of the book.
Well, yeah, this is. I mean, it's a classic book like this in that how to put it. Yes, I'd read it, but not personally. For me, it had completely dissolved into the ether. And the striking thing, I was wondering, is it one of these books where its effect has been so great that actually it's no longer sort of living as a book, and then you open it, start reading it with that great parable of in the first chapter, and you realise that the reason it had its effect isn't just because of the research. Fantastic writer, isn't she?
That's right, and it starts almost like a fractured fairy tale, doesn't it? It paints this cottage by a stream in a field, and by the end, just 2 pages in, it's died and the birds have gone silent.
Great beginning, yeah.
It's almost a case study in the cut-through communication, and it's fascinating to think where the environmental movement now is compared to where Rachel Carson started off. There's so much noise, so much street theatre, so many rallies, so much online activity. But looking back at how Rachel Carson did that book, a quiet, solitary science author, operating quietly and modestly and calmly, giving very calm interviews, looking like a completely regular person, despite, the agricultural chemical industry trying to demonise her and position her as something crazy.
That hasn't changed much,
Well, that was the part where I disagreed. The thing that I was absolutely shocked by reading it is why the environmental movement hasn't actually recruited the impact she had in terms of dealing with global warming. The truth of the matter is DDT did get rolled back significantly. A whole series of really, really toxic pesticides were banned, and yet the world and agriculture has gone on without any problem, in the same way as CFCs got banned and the world's gone on. And yet what you get at the moment is this whole incredibly hysterical argument, which is that if we find some way to address the externalities to do with global warming, the world's going to come to an end and we're going to suffer this huge economic catastrophe, which is clearly proved by the fact that, people did address what she was complaining about. and the world's absolutely fine, and the chemical companies go on making plenty of money, and agriculture continues to do well. So that was the part that I was shocked about, which was how powerful her argument was, and yet the current environmental movement isn't using it particularly effective in dealing with global warming.
Does that come back to the fact that she was just a particularly powerful communicator, that she really was a one-off?
I think she did have an established audience. She was already a best-selling nature writer, and I think that she had connected already with that broad audience in terms of her love of the natural environment, which is interesting when we come to these. The stories about climate change evoke a lot of fear in people, and they're very frightening, and I think that puts off a lot of the potential audience who might otherwise listen, but they're so afraid of the negative consequences that they turn off and
But you couldn't have got more frightening than the picture she was painted about these silent fields, and
but she also
it's
sends
very
a very
alarmist.
Yes,
really.
but she also sends a very positive message about what we can do to stop this, what we can do to. She doesn't paint a picture where it's all going to end in disaster. She's giving us hope that there's still something that can be done, and we just need to take that step and we can achieve it.
I don't think well, certainly not us, but I don't think anyone would actually challenge the inclusion of Silent Spring. It's an enormously influential book. Your book, Mark, is a more popular book, a bigger surprise. Tell us why you think financial journalist Michael Lewis's first book, Liar's Poker, changed the world.
Because he lit the fuse that blew up the world in the great financial crisis. If you actually look at his description of the beginning of the mortgage-backed securities market in Salomon Brothers, and the way that he has this sort of rather strange window on this whole obsession with money, to my mind, what Michael did was legitimise this absolute obscenity that destroyed the world financial markets. And if you reject that premise, I think you certainly see a book that changed the world in terms of a minor premise. He changed financial journalism and talking about money irrevocably. What Michael Lewis was trying to do when he turned his back and said, look, here I was on the threshold of a hugely successful career at Salomon Brothers and walked away from this to do something better, really saying to everybody else, you should walk away from this obsession with money.
So are you saying that Michael Lewis's book changed the world for the worse, if you like?
Yeah, I think he did exactly the opposite of what he was trying to do. What he was trying to say is, this is just disgusting. And instead, everybody looked at it and said, no, this is absolutely fantastic. Let's get more obscene, make the thing go even worse, so that whole culture where he sort of lifted up the carpet, looked at the cockroaches underneath and said, isn't this horrible? And everybody said, God, I want to be a cockroach.
Yeah, I guess there's a long history of this, isn't there? It goes right back to Blake saying of Milton that he was of the devil's party without knowing it.
Yes.
You know, so yeah, there's some prehistory.
I mean, it did make the sort of excesses and hijinks, really of really high capitalism, look kind of fun.
I agree, and so that's my point.
And that's the trouble. It's now leading to, Greeks rioting in the streets as this has flown on through the decades and the GFC occurred and it's compounded and now flowing through Europe. I mean, this is actually killing people on the ground. It begs the question of whether great books like the ones we're discussing today can release big ideas, some of which take hold and have consequences, as in the case of Silent Spring, but some of which just become the intellectual wallpaper and the forces driving them just continue untrammelled, as I think is the case in your book.
I think so.
Geoff, this is your pick.
Yeah, so Ways of Seeing, published in 1972. And I think it's not just a book that changed things, it was itself an example of change. So it was the book of a TV series. And I don't think the book on its own would have been so influential were it not for the TV series. Okay. So it's a book, I guess, about art history, the way that we look at art. Berger, that by then was sort of famous as a left-wing Marxist art critic for the New Statesman. But 1972 becomes colossally famous because of Ways of Seeing, and he wins the Booker Prize for his novel G. gets into a load of trouble because he gives half the prize money for the Black Panthers and keeps the other half for himself. Gets criticised for the left for keeping half and by the right for giving... Anyway, so yeah, 1972 was his year, but it seems to me that it's important in so many ways. He demonstrates that it comes in the wake of that Kenneth Clark series, Civilization, where we all stood and looked and gawped at the great triumphal history of Western civilization and the wonderful art it produced. Berger comes up with really, I suppose, an ideological critique of that. So he says with oil painting, it's a celebration of private property. Looks at this famous, timeless classic Gainsborough picture of the two people standing there with a lovely English countryside in a really quite effective agitprop way. He says, this is how I see this painting. Just puts a sticker on it saying, private property, keep out. He does that, but I think probably for me the most... and then he also talks about the way that reproduction of works of art has changed the way that we see them. But the most enduring part for me was it's 1972, right in that first wave of feminist publications. And he looks at the way that women have been presented throughout the history of painting. This is great. He has this great sort of aphoristic style. He says, men act, women appear. And then what he does, there's whole chapters which are non-verbal, just pictures, and he juxtaposes these timeless, undisputed classics of Western art, like where there's lots of nude women, of course, and then shows how the poses have been completely replicated in what this sounds so quaint in the era of internet porn. So it shows how the poses were replicated in girly magazines, and they are absolutely. And bear in mind, this was not something that was influenced by the female eunuch or sexual politics. It was absolutely contemporaneous with it.
And there's a great line he on the nude where he talks about that nudity for a woman is like a uniform, and it signifies that you are available for sex. And the worst thing about it is it's a uniform that a woman can't ever take off.
Yeah.
He was so pungent, wasn't he?
Exactly. I think one of the great things, though, if we sort of boiled this down, in the wake of Ways of Seeing, which became, the set text in all art colleges, and it was a new way of seeing art, at its worst, it boiled down to two very sort of crude ways of looking at art, of saying, OK, the whole of art history, actually, when you look at it, can be reduced to some sort of ideological reading, or that, even sort of more reductively, actually, the whole of Western art is essentially misogynistic. But I think that the great thing about Ways of Seeing for me is that there was nothing reductive at all about it. It actually made a load of dark oil paintings of men in ruffs and stuff. It made these old paintings seem more interesting, more complex.
Because there were assertions of property and ownership.
Yeah.
I never studied art. I had heard about this book and series. It was legendary, but I'd never seen it. And I saw it and read it after you mentioned. 1972, 2012, to me, it was still sensational, enlightening, opened my eyes, changed my relationship. So it's still got power. And
it's still shown to first-year students in schools of art right now. Still, it's sensational in a way. It's a bit like the Rachel Carson example. It's a brilliant packaging, essentially, of many other people's ideas. At the end of the first chapter, he basically, you turn the page and he says, Walter Benjamin wrote all this 50 years ago. With the feminist chapter, you're right, it was contemporaneous. But I think there'd been 2 or 3 years of really good early feminist work on the gaze, which he was feeding on. But what Berger did was he harnessed these ideas and communicated them in this incredible cut-through way. You couldn't miss his analysis. It wasn't buried in an academic journal, and suddenly the veil is torn from your eyes. And literally in this case, because after reading that book, after looking at his pictures and considering his text in relation to them, you can never again be an innocent viewer.
Do you know, that's so true. I was in a museum in Auckland recently where they had a picture. I was standing next to this lady. We were looking at a Dyer picture. It's called something like Lady Toweling Herself. And she's basically on her knees with her bottoms sticking in the air. And the woman next to me said, "That's a weird way to dry yourself." And I said, I don't think getting dry is the point, really. It's a pretext. And the thing is, it's kind of ludicrous that, that we were expected to view this as anything else than a picture of a bottom sticking in the air.
So My question is, my sense reading it, and I found it absolutely fascinating because I'd heard about it but hadn't read it before, is that he must feel a bit like Michael Lewis. The idea that within 25 or 30 years' time, somebody is able to sell a pickled shark for $6 million would make him absolutely cool.
Oh, you're so right. There's a kind of incredible irony here, in that the last chapter is all about what he calls publicity, what we would call advertising. And then it turns out that the person that made Britain who initiated the whole YBA thing is the advertising guy, Charles Saatchi. Yeah, it's a great irony.
Christine, what's your...
Sigmund Freud, The Interpretation of Dreams.
Da-da-da.
So after all
heavy.
After all of those really obvious, big, influential books kind of receded back, there was this image. You have to stop and think. Sigmund Freud, before he wrote this book, was a middle-aged Viennese neurologist struggling with some very radical ideas, with pretty much no audience. He was 40, his father died, and he went into a protracted period of crisis. And one of the things he did was spend a long period of self-reflection, and he included in it his dreams. And over the period of a couple of years, this lonely, relatively unsuccessful, obscure Viennese neurologist came up with concepts that now in the 20th and 21st century are completely accepted, unthinkingly, on a fairly dubious scientific basis, but with such broad popular acceptance, unthinking acceptance, that, maybe there really was something in it.
So what would you point... How did he change the history of thought?
Well, Freud was a huge fan of Darwin, and he looked at what Darwin did, and he wanted to do it for the life of the mind. He actually constructed in the interpretation of dreams the first kind of what has become a broadly accepted map of the mind, that we have this thing called a conscious mind, that we have an unconscious mind, that in fact that's where the big drama of our lives are happening, that it happens, largely stocked up through events in our childhood, that the incredible primal drives in the unconscious shape and influence our whole lives, and in fact that it's the kind of repository of really valuable data about ourselves that kind of break through every so often in the form of dreams.
When I first read Freud, and it was at the same time that I first read Marx as well. When I read Marx, I thought instantly, yeah, this is right. Of course, the cultural follows the economic. I read Freud, and it just seemed like a load of mumbo jumbo to me. And that hasn't really changed much, except insofar as now, as far as I can gather, when the science of sleep and our understanding of how the brain works, it makes you realise more than ever that the scientific foundation for this was pretty flimsy or non-existent. But it seems to me the great thing with Freud is it's become more than a belief system. It's become this great kind of a kind of series of myths, which now they. Even if we thought this wasn't, there is now such a thing as the Oedipus complex because he brought it into existence.
Well, promise you'll get right a reply. I just want to hear what Mark has to say.
No. Well, I think the first really important thing is that the neurology and the neurological development clearly has swung back after a period of time where the neurologists were saying that the idea of unconscious conflict was just absolutely rubbish. Ramchandran and the really cutting-edge, high-end neurologists at the moment are saying there's a huge amount to support Freud. So it's just beginning, as well as a whole lot of the meta-studies in terms of persistent long-term talk therapy look really, really positive. So you've got the bulk of mainstream opinion rejecting Freud at the moment, but certainly the people that you would look to be the best of the world's neurologists being far more sympathetic. But he makes such an entertaining figure because of the work that he did, which was really around sort of neurotic, sexually repressed Vietnamese women who clearly weren't getting enough.
Weren't getting enough psychoanalysis.
And so, I think you look at all of the people like Winnicott, Bion, Klein, etc., the people who really took his ideas and moved them forward in the 40s, 50s and 60s. You've got the bulk of stuff which I've always said was just the worst marketed piece of science I've ever seen. Certainly from my point of view, I tried to read The Interpretation of Dreams, but it is absolutely turgid, virtually unreadable stuff.
Hard to read, I would agree, but would you agree with Christine's hypothesis, which is that whether it was right or wrong on detail, and you're not claiming it's right in all detail,
Correct.
that its impact has changed the world? Would you accept that?
Yes.
But I think Freud's probably, his impact is more important in terms of the role of the individual and feeling that it was all right to look at something from a purely selfish point of view. It's bringing the me into the public debate, which is something that comes up in some of the other books we're talking about, that cult of the individual. We always think of books as the primary vehicle for ideas. Is that still true?
Well, I think what is certainly the case is that for a book to really have a big impact now, I think its thesis has to be, you have to be able to boil it down to just a kind of a few sound bites. So, I mean, Malcolm Gladwell is the master of this, so that you can, the tipping point, or he took it to a great extreme with the book Blink. All you need to do, you just need to know the title to sort of get the idea. I think it's much more difficult for a book that is very nuanced to have sort of earth-shaking effects.
A book is a much more substantive argument. It amasses all the evidence and puts it out there as a cohesive argument. And it's also one of the few opportunities readers and writers have to engage with each other in a sustained, focused period of interaction. So readers invite writers to speak to them for hours, in effect, when they're reading. And that's really quite unusual.
This is the absolute case study. Rachel Carson and her publishers put incredible thought into how to get this message across. The book wasn't going to be called Silent Spring. It was her editor's suggestion at Houghton Mifflin, because it was going to be the title of the chapter on birds. And the editor saw this and thought, this completely encapsulates what this book is about. And she persuaded Rachel Carson to call it Silent Spring. It was also part of the Houghton Mifflin editorial process that they encouraged her to come up with this little parable at the front.
Really?
And of course, millions of
Which we've
people-
been crediting with her brilliance.
Well, she did write it, and it is brilliantly written. But the point about this book is, like Blink, she was the original Malcolm Gladwell. You only need to know Silent Spring. And what do you think of? You think of silent paddocks full of, the absence of birds who are dead because of the DDT put on them. You can pick up that book. You can read the parable at the front, 2 pages. You don't have to read the rest of the book. The trouble is, this is a panel of not only readers but writers. And after this discussion, we really have to ask ourselves, is it worth writing books? You look at Liar's Poker and the lack of consequence to that, and Barbarians at the Gate. I mean, why bother giving up 3 or 4 years of your life sitting at a hard, cold desk and knocking one out if it has, at the end of the day, so little impact, Mark?
That's an easy one to answer. It beats working for a living.
You must be getting someone to write your books for you. I think writing is a painless job.
I would argue precisely because, whether I found Freud's dreams a little hard to take, I still found it an incredibly powerful and interesting book. And you went away from that book. I mean, I was completely galvanised by Berger. I loved Liar's Pokers, and I mourned for Michael Lewis not having managed to get those people into the marine science courses. But nonetheless, fantastic insight. And Rachel Carson's Silent Spring is not dead. I mean, Al Gore has the picture of Rachel Carson on his office when he was out there making his film, which did An Inconvenient Truth, which did shift the world a little bit. So I would say...
You old optimist. Look, I just want more consequences for the big books. Rachel Carson would be amazed by today's environmental movement. Yet, how hard was it to get a carbon price up in this country? It's ridiculous. The asymmetry between the power of the case embodied in books like these and the consequences, the actions that flow from them, to me, I want more bang for my book.
You look at books that we didn't have, like you were talking, Jane Jacobs' book, and also the one that I keep on coming back to, Guns, Germs and Steel. If you look at that book, maybe it hasn't changed the world, but what it's been able to do is just allow people to find a place of peace and understanding in terms of trying to explain the world and what's going on around them and why we have the inequities we do. And you sit there and you think, if that were ever inside me, that would be the reason to dedicate 5 years of my life to writing something as great as that.
Well, I would say we can't act if we don't think, and in my opinion, we can't think if we don't read. That is our show for tonight. A big thank you to tonight's guests. It's been fabulous to have Danielle Clode, Mark Carnegie, Geoff Dyer and Christine Wallace. Thank you. And you know, given there are as many books as there are readers, and there are ideas to burn, this has been such a great special. We think we should do this every year. So why don't you go to our website or our Facebook and tell us your nominations for books that change the world, because we're going to come back to this subject. It's a beauty. Please join us, won't you, for the regular book club next week, where we'll be joined by Charlotte Wood and Jeffrey Cousins. Until then, very happy reading. Thank you for your company and good night.